I was fired in a meeting that lasted 8 minutes. No handshake, no questions, just a quiet decision already printed waiting in a folder on the table. I didn't speak much that morning. Didn't ask why. Didn't need to, because I'd seen it coming. My name is Thomas Tran. I'm 37 years old, a software engineer by trade. But really, I build things that most people don't see until they stop working. For the last 7 years, I was the silent co-founder of a tech startup based in Palo Alto. You've probably never heard of us. Unless you worked in logistics. Then you definitely did. We built the scheduling engine that powered most of the West Coast's warehouse operations. Automated routes, delivery, sequencing, inventory, logic. All of it ran on one system. A system I wrote from scratch. We called it Eve. Marcus came up with the name. He was the other co-founder, my best friend at the time, the face of the company. He was charming, fast-talking, had that VC shine. I was the quiet one with the laptop. For years that worked. He pitched, I built. He shook hands. I wrote code. Until the funding got bigger. Then suddenly I wasn't in the room anymore. The day I got fired, I walked into the conference room at 9:02 a.m. Marcus was already there, flanked by a young HR rep I didn't recognize. A fresh suit, corporate smile, and a sealed folder. "We're restructuring," Tom Marcus said. He looked tired, or maybe just relieved. "It's nothing personal. Just time for a new chapter." I nodded. He slid the folder toward me. Inside my exit package, NDA, and a small line item about returning my hardware. I signed without reading. Handed him the badge. Didn't say goodbye. As I stepped outside, the sun hit me hard. Silicon Valley mornings are always colder than they look. And yet I felt oddly warm. Calm. Because I hadn't come to that meeting empty-handed. Back at home, I opened my laptop. The old one. Not the company machine. There was a folder on the desktop, labeled "If Fired." Inside were 3 files. My original codebase from the first year, the signed copyright registration for Eve under my name, and a detailed version history with timestamps proving authorship. They didn't know, or they forgot. But before we took our first seed round, I filed for individual IP protection. Not to be sneaky, just to be careful. Marcus once told me legal stuff can wait. Let's focus on shipping first. So I nodded, and quietly did both. You see, I don't raise my voice when something's wrong. I prepare. Maybe that's why they thought I'd just walk away. Fade out quietly like some forgotten back-end dev. But I didn't fade. I waited, and I watched, and I remembered something my grandfather once told me. If someone builds a house on your land, they don't own the house. I don't know if this story will sound like revenge. It's not meant to. It's meant to remind anyone listening that just because you're not loud doesn't mean you're not in control. And if you've ever been pushed out of something you helped build, if you've ever walked away from a room that used to be yours, subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for you. Because what happens next isn't just about me getting even. It's about making sure they never do it to the next person. To understand what they lost, you need to know what I built. Eve wasn't just a codebase, it was an ecosystem. 96 original files, thousands of lines, every module documented with handwritten notes. I'd stayed up entire nights refining the algorithm that made it run lean, less than 2 MB compiled. There were no shortcuts, no borrowed libraries. Just me, coffee, and a rented apartment with peeling paint and 2 routers overheating in the closet. Back then, Marcus slept on the floor of the living room. We couldn't afford office space. He would wake up, rehearse his pitch out loud, and I'd sit there debugging syntax errors. That's where Eve was born. Not in some glossy deck, but in 3 a.m. moments when no one was watching. I don't think Marcus is evil. I think he forgot. Forgot who built the core. Forgot what made it work. Forgot that systems like people only function when you respect their boundaries. He thought the new CTO could restructure the stack, but you can't rewire something if you don't know where the wires go. There's more to this story, a lot more. But for now, I'll leave you with this. When I walked out of that office, I didn't take revenge. I took ownership, and that made all the difference. People think startups begin with pitch decks. They don't. They start in silence. In the hours when nothing's moving and you're still at your screen. When the cursor blinks. When the coffee goes cold. When nobody's watching. That's when it happens. That's when it happened for me. 7 years ago, I sat on the floor of my friend's spare bedroom in Mountain View. Laptop on a cardboard box. Wi-Fi barely reaching. Outside the streetlight buzzed. Inside it was just me and a blinking terminal. I was writing the first lines of what would become Eve. Not a product, not a prototype. Just an idea, one that had been turning over in my head for months. What if warehouse routing could learn like people? What if it didn't just follow fixed paths but adjusted in real time? Moved like intuition, not instruction. That night I wrote 96 lines of code. Simple, elegant. A recursive pattern engine with a memory map. A heartbeat function that checked conditions every 4 milliseconds. And a delay tolerance buffer that adjusted based on incoming load. When I tested it, nothing worked. Then it crashed. Then it froze. Then it ran. And when it ran, I knew I wasn't going back. Marcus had called me 2 months earlier. He had this idea, a logistics startup. Big market, he said. Ugly software everywhere. We'll be different. I wasn't sold, not yet, but I owed him a lot. We went back to college. He got me through some dark times after my mom passed. Helped me pay rent once when I was stuck between jobs. So when he said, I don't need a business partner, I need a builder, I said yes. He pitched. I built. That was the deal. Marcus had a gift. People listened to him. He could turn frustration into funding. Walk into a room full of tired investors and leave them excited. But what we didn't have was a product. That's where I came in. I didn't just write features. I designed the engine. Everything about Eve was layered. From the cache hierarchy to the failover logic. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. And more than that, it learned. The more warehouses it touched, the better it got. In those early days, we couldn't afford cloud credits. I ran simulations on my personal machine overnight. Stacked 2 fans on top to stop it overheating. I'd wake up to logs printed across the wall monitor. Sometimes red, sometimes green. But always progress. That's what building looks like. Not headlines, not TechCrunch, just logs, lines, and late nights. I kept notes in a black notebook. Not because I had to, but because part of me still didn't trust the cloud. Every function name, every patch, every weird bug and why it happened. I never thought it would matter later. But it did. We got our first client in month 6, a regional distributor in San Jose. They were using spreadsheets to plan truck routes. Eve cut their delivery time by 28% in the first week. After that, things moved fast. We got into an accelerator, then raised seed money, then a Series A. I watched as Marcus grew into his role. New suits, new friends, new language. He started talking about user journeys and value alignment. I still called things what they were. There was a moment early on that should have told me something. We were finalizing paperwork with our first investor, and I asked casually, should we register the IP under the company or ourselves? Marcus waved it off. Don't worry about it. We're a team. Paperwork just slows things down. He smiled like it was obvious. I nodded. Then a week later, I registered the code in my name. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I trusted reality. Most people don't see betrayal until it's too late, but I'd grown up watching quiet patterns. I knew how things shifted before they broke. My father worked in factories. Said you could tell a machine was going to fail by the sound it didn't make. I remembered that. So I listened. When Marcus started skipping stand-ups. When legal contracts arrived with names I didn't recognize. When I was no longer invited to pitch meetings. All of it was quiet. But it wasn't random. The thing is, none of this made me angry. Not yet. I was too busy building. Too focused on the architecture to notice the politics. Until one day I saw a job posting on our website. Senior Systems Architect. It listed my exact responsibilities. Same stack, same scope. Except I wasn't the one hiring. Marcus had posted it, without telling me. That was the first time I saved a screenshot. I'm not dramatic. I don't slam doors. I don't raise my voice. But I do remember. And I prepare. That's what part of me knew even back then, that this story wouldn't end with a handshake. It would end with silence, and then something else. Something only I could do. You might think 96 lines of code can't change anything. But when those lines form the core of a system used by 47 distribution hubs across California, they're not just code. They're leverage. And I still held the original key. You'd think the money would change things. And it did. But not in the way I expected. We closed our Series A at $5.4 million. It felt surreal. 1 minute we were making cold brew in a shared WeWork kitchen. The next we were incorporated in Delaware, onboarding enterprise clients, hiring fast. Investors called Marcus a visionary. He didn't correct them. He started dressing differently, talking faster, walking like there was always a pitch waiting just around the corner. I didn't mind. At first, we moved into a real office. Glass walls, whiteboards, polished concrete floors. Marcus got his own corner, with a view. I took the desk next to the server room. It was quiet there, cool. No one asked me where I wanted to sit, but I didn't complain. The truth is, I liked it that way. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I just wanted the system to run, and it did. By the end of that year, we were profitable. Barely, but still. Clients were renewing. Referral deals were rolling in. We landed our first international contract. Marcus started showing up in podcasts, panels, founder spotlights. He always mentioned the team, but never by name. I was our engineer, once the back-end guy. One night I was watching a replay of his interview on a startup media site. The host asked, "So how did you build such a resilient system so quickly?" Marcus paused for half a second, then smiled. We had access to some external talent. Super cost-effective. I sat in the dark, paused the video, played that sentence again. External talent. That was the moment something in me changed. The next morning I came into the office early, logged into my private repo, created a new branch called Silent Mode. I didn't touch production. Didn't break anything. But from that day on, I started documenting everything. Every commit, every conversation, every quiet moment that felt off. Not because I planned to use it, but because I stopped trusting that I wouldn't need to. There were signals. You always notice them in hindsight, but they were there. Small things. I'd make suggestions in meetings, get brushed aside. Marcus would introduce new hires to the leadership team, and I wasn't in the photo. My email got left off a calendar invite for a quarterly planning session. I found out about it when someone asked me, "Hey, why weren't you on the call?" I just said I had a conflict. That became my default response. I started working more from home. There it was easier to focus. No open office noise, no passing glances. Just the hum of my own machine and a list of unresolved tickets that only I knew how to fix. Clients kept asking for more customization. I built tools, quietly pushed updates under generic commit messages. One day I walked by a meeting room and heard my name. I paused outside the glass door just long enough to catch the phrase, "We'll eventually phase out Tom's layer and move to a vendor solution." My chest tightened, not from panic, from clarity. They were preparing to replace me, piece by piece, but they didn't understand the system. Not really. They saw the interface, the dashboard, the graphs. They didn't see the logic behind it. The invisible threads that held everything together. The places where the system forgave human mistakes. The subtle rules I'd written after watching real operators make real decisions in real time. There was one client in Oregon who'd once called me directly. Their routing was failing during a snowstorm. Marcus was at a conference. Support team was offline. I stayed up until 3 a.m., adjusting buffer logic for icy roads. They never missed a delivery. Nobody talked about that. One day I opened our company's website and noticed something new. A team page. Everyone had a photo, a short bio, except me. I wasn't listed. I scrolled twice, checked again. Nothing. Then I noticed something stranger. A job opening senior infrastructure lead. The description was familiar. Too familiar. It was my job, reworded. At the bottom it said reports to VP of Engineering, a role we didn't have. Yet. I didn't say anything. Just saved a copy of the posting. Dated it. Backed it up. That night I sat on my balcony looking out over the street. Kids were playing down below. Someone's dog barked. Sprinklers kicked on across the road. And I thought, this isn't about ego. It's about knowing what happens when the people who build things are forgotten. The funny thing is, I never stopped shipping code. Even as I felt myself disappearing, I still cared about the system, about the people using it, about the warehouses depending on it. But I knew, sooner or later, they'd make it official. I didn't know when, but I was ready. Because when they finally cut me out, they'd realize they'd only taken the visible part. The invisible, that still belonged to me. His name was David Chu. He came in during Q3, new CFO, Stanford MBA, private equity background. The kind of guy who didn't ask how things worked, only how much they cost. He wore fitted suits, talked in clean bullet points, never stayed in meetings longer than 8 minutes. The first time we met, he didn't shake my hand, just looked up from his tablet and said, "You're the one who built the engine, right?" I nodded. David glanced back down. Cool. That was it. The next week I noticed something odd. Access logs. Someone from the finance team had requested infrastructure reports. Load stats. Uptime. Usage by region. Stuff they never looked at before. Then came the spreadsheets. Data dumps from engineering. Requests for headcount costs broken down by module. No one asked me directly. They didn't have to. It was obvious what was happening. They were calculating how much I cost, and how much it would cost to not need me. Marcus changed too. He wasn't around as much. Less time in the office, more flights, more panels. He stopped checking in, stopped asking about product roadmap. Then one morning he forwarded me an email chain. Subject line: vendor options, transition plan discussion. No greeting, no comment, just the thread. Inside a list of third-party platforms that might replicate core logic with reduced dependency. I stared at it for a long time, then forwarded it to my personal inbox, just in case. 2 days later, I was invited to a review session. Conference room B. David was there. Marcus, too. An HR rep I didn't recognize sat off to the side. I knew what it was. Not the moment, the setup. They wanted to see how I'd react. Whether I'd push back, make noise, create trouble. I didn't. David started talking. Said the company was entering a new phase. Said we needed to optimize for scale. Said that core functions should be modular, replicable, and eventually externalized. Then he paused, looked at me. "Do you understand where this is going?" I smiled, just barely. "Sure." He seemed surprised, maybe disappointed. Marcus cleared his throat. "Of course, we still value what you've built. And we want to give you space to land somewhere great." That was the script. The polite version of goodbye. The kind that gets printed and handed out in packets. I didn't respond, just folded my hands and waited. David nodded to HR. The packet was slid across the table. Inside severance, NDA, transition guidelines. They offered me 3 weeks. 3. After 7 years. I looked at Marcus. He avoided my eyes. So I stood, took the packet, tucked it under my arm, and walked out. No handshake, no parting words, just the sound of the glass door closing behind me. Back at my desk, I began to pack. There wasn't much. An old mug, a photo of my father, a second-hand keyboard I never got reimbursed for. Someone walked by and looked away quickly. The office had that quiet tension, the kind people feel when someone gets erased. I didn't say goodbye, didn't want to make it sentimental. I just dropped the box into the back seat of my car and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. There was a part of me that wanted to feel something. Anger, grief, shock. But all I felt was stillness, because I had seen this coming, and I had prepared. At home I opened my laptop, not the company one, my personal one. Encrypted, isolated, offline. I navigated to a folder labeled Eve 01. Inside were the original architecture diagrams, the first test logs, every license and registration I had filed. And then the contract, the one I signed before we formed the company. A quiet piece of paper that transferred ownership of my code, only under specific terms. Terms they had broken. Eve wasn't open source. It wasn't public domain. It was mine. Licensed to the company under my name. I held the keys. I set the conditions. And buried in the logic, deep in the heartbeat code, was a control gate. A single Boolean. If toggled, it wouldn't shut the system down. It would just slow it. Just enough to raise questions, trigger reviews, force a conversation. I didn't flip it. Not yet, but I remembered where it was. The next morning I got a message. Not from Marcus, not from David. From Linda. She was on the support team. One of the few who knew how Eve really worked. The message was short. Something's off with load balancing. Clients are reporting latency. Can you check? I stared at the screen, took a breath, and typed, "Not my system anymore." Then I closed the laptop, sat back, and listened to the silence. The badge didn't beep when I tapped in. That was the first sign. It just blinked red, twice, then stayed silent. I stood there for a moment, half expecting someone from security to wave me in. But no one moved. I glanced at the front desk. The receptionist smiled politely, then looked away. It was subtle, efficient, exactly how they like things now. I turned around, walked out without a word. No emails, no calls, no official explanation. Just a red light and silence. The next hour felt oddly calm. I drove home without music. Stopped for coffee. Paid in cash. Waited in line like nothing had changed. Back at my apartment, I didn't unpack the box from my desk. Just set it on the floor. Then I pulled out the laptop. The old one. Mine. I plugged it in. Waited for it to boot. The fan spun softly. The screen lit up glowing pale in the dim light of the room. I opened the folder. If fired. Inside were 4 files. Source code, full repository, date stamped. Copyright certificate. License agreement with terms. Notes from the first 6 months of builds. I read through them slowly, not because I needed to, but because it grounded me. Reminded me that I hadn't imagined any of this. That every line had been written by my hands. Tested, debugged, reworked, made clean. This was mine, and I still owned it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted them to remember what they'd tried to erase. And so I logged into the management console. The admin dashboard for Eve still had my backup account. They'd forgotten to revoke it. Buried in the system was a toggle, a single switch labeled Compliance Review Mode. It didn't break anything, didn't delete data, didn't sound alarms. But it did slow down certain processes, introduced latency, triggered backup protocols. In short, it made everything just a little harder to ignore. I clicked it. The change propagated across the network in under 90 seconds. Warehouses wouldn't notice it right away. But by end of day, things would feel off. Delivery estimates would stretch. System logs would grow. Help tickets would rise. And someone would ask why. Then I did something small. I printed out the copyright certificate, taped it to the wall above my desk, right where I could see it. Not out of pride, but as a reminder that sometimes silence speaks, and sometimes it needs to be framed. 2 days later, the emails started. First from support. "Hey Tom, hope you're well. Quick question, have you noticed any issues with the batch scheduler?" I didn't respond. Then one from Marcus. "Just looping you in." A couple clients mentioned delays, wondering if this relates to any legacy settings. Legacy. That word again. As if what I built had already passed into memory. I closed the message. Didn't reply. By day 4, I got a call. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was someone from the board, polite, curious, measured. "We'd love to connect if you have time this week. Just to align on the next phase of engagement." Next phase. There it was. They thought they could pull me back in, make it feel like a conversation, like a partnership. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was a reminder. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I started something new. A fresh directory on my drive, labeled Eve Next. I opened a blank document, typed a single sentence. "Rewrite begins when memory fades." Then I saved, closed the lid, and sat in the quiet. That night I walked past the office building, just to see it. It looked the same. Lights on, shadows moving behind glass. A company still pretending everything was normal. But I knew, behind those walls, someone was staring at a dashboard that didn't make sense anymore. Calling engineers who didn't have answers. Reading logs that told them nothing. And wondering, when did this all start to slip? The answer was simple. It started the day they treated code like concrete, like something fixed, something lifeless. But it never was. It was a living system, shaped by the person who knew its rhythm, held together by decisions made at 3 a.m., long before legal had a nameplate on the door. I stood there for a while, just watching. Then I turned, walked home, and didn't look back. I didn't hear from Marcus for a week. Just silence. No messages, no calls, only a growing trail of confusion left behind in the system logs. Eve didn't crash, it didn't fail, but it slowed. Small things first. Dashboard load times, delayed auto-routing, discrepancies between projected and actual delivery windows. Tiny gaps, just wide enough for people to notice, but not understand. I monitored everything from home, not actively, just quietly. Logs streamed across my secondary screen. No alerts, just patterns. The kind you don't catch with tools, only with time. I knew those patterns. I built them. Day 6, I got a message from Linda again. "Clients are getting anxious. Lag is compounding. Can you help us isolate?" I almost replied, but stopped myself, because this wasn't my job anymore. Not by their choice. And helping them now would only rewrite the story. They wanted me gone. They got it. All that was left was the consequence. Later that afternoon, I logged in to check something. My backup admin key had finally been revoked. They found it. Took them long enough. But it didn't matter. I had already turned the switch. There was no way to flip it back unless they rebuilt the logic. And they couldn't. They didn't know where to start. I smiled, not out of spite, just recognition of the line they crossed, and how far they'd gone before realizing they'd lost the map. Sometimes people think silence means surrender. It doesn't. Silence is preparation. It's the pause before precision. It's the sound of weight being measured, before it's dropped. I didn't break anything. I didn't sue. Didn't go public. Didn't rant on LinkedIn or forward emails to tech blogs. I just waited and watched. On day 8, I got another email, this time from an investor, not a small one. Someone I'd only met twice. Both times they'd looked right past me, but now they were writing directly. "Tom, I'm hearing conflicting things. Marcus says everything's stable, but we're seeing churn. Any insight you can share off the record would help." That phrase again, off the record, as if that made it clean, as if 7 years of silence could be unraveled by a single polite request. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in months. Eve Notes Personal. Inside were voice memos. Notes from nights spent debugging code while Marcus slept. Early whiteboard photos. A picture of the first delivery route ever completed. All of it forgotten. By them, but not by me. The more they tried to fix Eve, the worse it got. They brought in consultants, outsourced performance reviews, ran stress tests on the API layer. None of it worked, because the slowness wasn't a bug. It was a condition, a silent flag that turned the whole machine into a riddle. And I was the only one who knew the answer. That weekend I drove out to the coast, left my phone behind, took a notebook. Just the sound of the ocean and wind through the trees. I sat on a bench and thought about all the people I'd never met, operators in cold warehouses, dispatchers checking dashboards at 5 a.m., drivers waiting on optimized routes that no longer came on time. They were the ones I cared about, still did. Not Marcus, not David, not the board. The users. The people depending on something they didn't even know I'd built. And then it hit me. Maybe this wasn't about revenge. Maybe it was about rewriting the balance. Because what they broke wasn't the system. It was the trust. They thought silence meant weakness, but I was never weak. Just quiet. If you've made it this far, you probably know someone like me. Or maybe you are someone like me. Someone who built quietly, got overlooked, then pushed out when the time came to scale. If that's you, subscribe to this channel. Not for the drama, not for the payoff, but because the next part of this story isn't just about what they did. It's about what I did next. And if you've ever been quietly underestimated, you'll want to hear it. It started with a missed delivery in Chicago. One warehouse, one glitch. No big deal on paper, but it triggered a chain reaction. Delays stacked, routes jammed. Real-time adjustments stopped syncing. By noon, 5 clients were on emergency calls. By end of day 3, had paused operations. Not canceled, just paused. A word that buys time, but means something else behind closed doors. I wasn't watching from a distance anymore. That day I was in it, quietly. An observer with all the keys but no seat at the table. I had alerts set up. Not for failure, but for friction. Metrics most teams don't track. Because friction doesn't scream. It wears you down. Marcus called that night. I let it ring, then rang again and again. The voicemail was short. We need to talk. Things are getting weird. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. 2 days later, the board called a special session. That's when the real panic started. They looped in product heads, ops, and external auditors. They tore through logs, ran simulations, rechecked cloud configurations. But they were missing one thing. The why. The symptoms were there, but the cause was hidden. Because I'd buried it. Not to harm them, but to remind them. I got a message from Linda. Just 5 words. This isn't what you wanted. She was right. It wasn't. I didn't want people stressed. Didn't want teams burned out chasing ghosts. But I wasn't the one who removed context. Or fired the person who held it. They made that choice. I just let gravity do the rest. Inside the system, the code was still clean. No viruses, no corruption. But the rhythm was off. Eve wasn't broken. It was resisting. Because it had been treated like a product, not a process. And processes remember how they're treated. By the end of the week, one of the original investors stepped in. They issued a request-independent review. A third-party team was brought in to evaluate platform integrity. I knew one of the engineers on the team. We'd met at a back-end architecture panel years ago. He messaged me. "This is elegant. It's not sabotage. It's design." I didn't answer, but I smiled. Because he saw it. Finally, someone saw the difference. Sabotage is messy, loud, driven by anger. But design is quiet, patient, woven in over time like a whisper between lines. They never saw it coming, because it wasn't loud. I didn't expect what came next. Marcus resigned. It was announced on a Friday morning. One of those classic email blasts, stepping down to explore new opportunities. No mention of problems, no public questions. But inside the company, everyone knew. The system had spoken, and it didn't speak in meetings. It spoke in timeouts, in cold data, in missed SLAs. Things Marcus never truly understood. David stayed, the CFO. He tried to stabilize things. Hired 2 new engineers. Started drafting a proposal to migrate off Eve completely. It would take 9 months, at minimum. I read the draft when it leaked. They didn't know half of what the system depended on. They'd need to rebuild logic from scratch, and even then there were no guarantees. Clients began asking questions. Why are response times slower? Why does routing feel less adaptive? Why isn't anyone answering technical tickets? The board asked for weekly status reports. Revenue projections were revised downward. People stopped smiling in the hallways. Meanwhile, I kept writing. Not code. Notes. Observations. Ideas. I wasn't building a sequel, not yet, but I was watching, learning, letting time tell me what mattered next. One evening I got a package, no return address, inside a simple black notebook. No note, just one sticky tab on the first page. It read, "You built more than they understood." I recognized the handwriting. It was Linda's. I turned the page, blank, just paper, waiting. So I picked up a pen and wrote, "Systems don't forget, but people do." Then I closed the book and sat in the dark, thinking, not about what was lost, but what might still be written. The email came on a Tuesday. Simple subject line, checking in quick chat. It was from David, still the CFO, still trying to hold it all together. I let it sit unread for half a day, not out of pettiness, just to feel the weight of it. Let the silence expand. Then I opened it. "Hi, Tom. Hope you're doing well. We're working through a few internal transitions and could use your input. Not formal, just a conversation. Let me know if you're open to talking. Best, David." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was something, an opening. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reread the last thread from Marcus, the one where he forwarded vendor migration plans without a word. I remember how that felt, how cold it was, how final. And now they wanted to talk. 2 days later, another message came. This one from someone on the board. More formal, more desperate. "We're aware of the current issues. Our team believes you could provide critical insight. If there's interest in re-engaging, we're happy to discuss what that could look like." That phrase, re-engaging, polished, clean, like nothing ever happened. Like I hadn't been erased. Like my badge hadn't been cut without a word. I closed the email, made tea, sat by the window, and let myself think. What would going back even mean? Would I walk into the same building, nod at the same people, sit in the same chair? Would they smile and pretend nothing had changed? Would I? I opened my notebook, the black one Linda had sent, flipped to a new page, wrote a question. "Can you return to a place that didn't keep space for you?" The next morning I replied, "Short. Happy to talk. Let me know when." David set up a call. Friday, noon, Zoom. No office, no cameras, just audio. He started with small talk. Asked how I was doing. I didn't answer that part. Just said, "Let's talk about the system." His voice shifted. A little more measured. A little more careful. He said what I expected. The platform was under strain. Client confidence was wavering. The board wanted stability. Then he asked the question, "Would you consider coming back as a consultant, just short term?" I let the silence hang. Then I asked my own question. "Why me?" He hesitated, then said something almost honest. "Because no one else knows how to make it breathe." That word stuck with me, breathe. Because Eve wasn't just code. It responded, adjusted, learned. It had a rhythm, and they had broken it. He offered a number, a big one. Consulting contract, equity refresh, whatever I needed. I didn't answer right away. I just asked for the documents. Told him I'd review everything in writing. And I did. Later that night, the contract was clean, almost generous. They wanted me back. But they wanted something more than just my time. They wanted trust. They wanted to believe I'd fix what they couldn't name. But trust doesn't come on demand. It's built, or rebuilt, slowly. I slept on it, woke up early, went for a walk, let the city move around me while I stood still. At a corner cafe, I watched a delivery truck pause at a green light, then move again. Simple, predictable, just like we had promised Eve would make things, until they forgot what powered it. Not servers, not funding, understanding. I emailed David the next day, told him I'd agree to a short-term review. No system access, no credentials, just observation. "Let me look," I said, "then we'll talk." He agreed. That week they gave me sandbox credentials. Read-only access, no production rights. I logged in, stared at dashboards that once felt like home. They'd changed the UI, added colors, new icons, glossy layers over tired logic. But underneath, it was still my system, still mine. I spent 3 days reviewing logs, didn't touch anything, just listened. Eve was choking. Not because it was wrong, but because it had been misunderstood. Engineers had patched things they didn't need to touch. Removed redundancy they thought was waste. But every line I wrote had a reason, a rhythm, and that rhythm had been lost. On the 4th day I wrote a report. 7 pages, simple language. No blame. Just facts, observations, a map of where things had drifted, and then a note at the end. The system isn't dying. It's confused. You don't need a rebuild. You need to remember how it thinks. I sent the file. No comment. David replied an hour later. Just 2 words. Thank you. And for the first time in a long time, I believed he meant it. I thought the report would help. I really did. 7 pages, clear language, no technical ego, no blame. Just a roadmap, where the system had drifted, where they'd patched over living logic, and what it would take to bring it back to center. I didn't expect applause, but I expected them to follow it. They didn't. Instead, they built a task force. 4 engineers, 1 project manager, 2 consultants who hadn't written a line of real-time code in 5 years. They called it Operation Stability. Cute name, but I knew what it meant. Control. If they fixed it on their terms, they could own the outcome. Rewrite the story. Avoid the part where they needed me. David looped me in on calls, asked for input at milestones, used phrases like alignment and collaboration. I nodded, spoke only when I had to. But every time I watched them talk, I saw it happening. They weren't trying to understand the system. They were trying to conquer it. 2 weeks in, the lead consultant suggested rewriting the root evaluator. Said it was overly recursive. Said modern systems don't need that level of complexity. I listened, quiet, then asked, what happens when 3 delivery windows overlap during a traffic event and one of them has a temperature constraint? He blinked, paused, said that's an edge case. I said nothing, because that edge case was Thursday in Chicago, every week. They started making changes anyway. Isolated ones at first. Removed a latency buffer I'd tuned by hand. Collapsed 2 logic trees to simplify flow. It didn't crash, not at first, but things got slower. Again, 1 warehouse in Phoenix reported timeouts, then another in Salt Lake. Support requests spiked. They held a call. Blamed load, blamed AWS, blamed legacy complexity. No one said my name, but the silence had shape, and I recognized it. David messaged me privately. You okay with how things are progressing? I replied with a single line. I gave you a map. You took scissors to it. He didn't respond. The next week, a new issue emerged. It wasn't performance. It was behavior. The system started rerouting trucks around cold zones, even when those zones were safe. A patch they'd made to optimize safety had backfired. Frozen goods arrived thawed. Clients were furious. And the consultants, they blamed the dataset. That night, I pulled up a private mirror of the code. My original branch. I read through the logic I'd written 4 years earlier. Every line still made sense. Still held purpose. Not clever, just aware. Built from time, from listening, from watching real people do real work, and asking what they needed, instead of what sounded impressive in a deck. I started sketching. Not a fix. A fork. A cleaner version, less baggage, same soul. Just enough to remind myself what it felt like to build without politics. I didn't tell anyone. Just kept the notebook open beside me while I worked. Line by line, silently. The team pushed another update. This time it broke warehouse sync in 2 regions. Clients lost visibility for 4 hours. David called me. For real. Voice, not email. We might need to revisit your original logic. Would you be open to... I stopped him. I already gave you the map. He was quiet. I know. We thought we could shortcut it. That was the truth. They wanted the destination without the path. The outcome without the process. The reward without the relationship. And Eve didn't work that way. Because Eve wasn't just a system. It was a memory of how we built, how we thought, how we cared when no one else was looking. Later that night, I stared at the system logs again, watched another timeout ripple through the network, watched the recovery functions strain to catch up, and I knew what would come next. More calls, more blame, more pressure to make it work fast. But they didn't need fast. They needed understanding. And until they chose that, I wouldn't step in. I closed the laptop, put the notebook away, turned off the lights, and let the system speak for itself. Because sometimes the best way to be heard is to stop talking. I didn't plan to build it, not at first. It started with a few sketches, then a prototype directory. Just small things, notes, diagrams, logic stubs. I wasn't thinking about scale, wasn't thinking about launch. Just wanted to remember how it felt to create something honest. No politics, no rewrites from people who never read the first line. No meetings where vision died under fluorescent lights. Just code and the quiet clarity it brought. The working name was HollowFork, a private nod to what I left behind and what I intended to leave empty. It wasn't revenge, it was remembrance. I built slowly. No deadlines, no product roadmap, just function by function. I rewrote the core logic that had once powered Eve, but cleaner, smarter, fewer dependencies, no corporate debt, no layers of abstraction to protect egos. It responded the way Eve used to, before they started changing it to match quarterly projections. I didn't tell anyone, didn't post, didn't tease, didn't even register a domain. Just let it breathe. Sometimes that's all a system needs. Time. And someone who understands what not to touch. While I built, I watched the original system falter. Clients continued to file complaints. Delivery times slipped. Warehouses grew louder. They were burning credibility, slowly, quietly. It wouldn't be a headline, but it would cost them more than money. Trust bleeds out in silence. One night, I reopened a file I hadn't touched since year one. Evaluator Virtus, the very first root logic I wrote. It was messy, brilliant in places, naive in others, but it worked. I stared at it for a long time, then rewrote it, line by line, not as a copy, but as an answer to everything I'd learned since. The new version didn't need layers, didn't need fallback rules that tried to please every edge case. It just listened, took in data, made decisions based on the real world, not a clean demo environment. I called it Pulse, because that's what it felt like. Alive, reactive, tuned to friction, not fantasy. By week 4, I had a working system. Fully simulated, lightweight, modular. It couldn't run an entire logistics network yet, but it could tell you when your assumptions were wrong. And that's where most systems fail, not in the math, but in the belief that reality will cooperate. Linda called. First time in months. She didn't ask how I was. She just said, "It's worse. They've stopped talking about the root cause, just shifting blame now." I didn't say much, only asked how she was holding up. She paused, then said, "Tired, but you knew that part already." We hung up, but something lingered. A quiet permission to do something with what I'd built. That night, I tested Pulse under live data. I spoofed inputs from 3 states, simulated real traffic warehouse constraints, driver patterns. It held, even under stress. It didn't solve everything, but it adapted, better than I expected. And in a way Eve no longer could. I thought about releasing it. Open source, free. Let the right people find it. Let them use it the way it was meant to be used. But I wasn't ready. Not because I doubted the code, but because I didn't know what it would become. I'd spent years watching something pure get corrupted, turned into a performance metric. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I printed the core logic, held the pages in my hand. It felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of something living, something real. And I knew this wasn't just a fork. It was a beginning. Back at the old company, they were still spinning. David had stopped emailing. The board brought in an interim CTO. They floated a memo about restructuring for operational clarity. But none of it changed the logs. Eve was tired, not from code, from being misunderstood too many times in a row. I didn't need them to fail. That was never the point. I just needed to remember what it felt like to build something that didn't ask for permission to be itself. And now, I heard about it through Linda. A quiet message. They're rebuilding. Not from your map this time. They're trying to copy you. I didn't answer right away. Just stared at the message, then closed the window. A week later I saw the deck. It leaked, like they always do. 33 slides, internal pitch, new system architecture, same mission, new name. Except, it wasn't new. It was a shadow. They'd taken the old bones, trimmed the language, shifted labels, and dressed it up as innovation. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it before, in tech, in teams, in boardrooms. The moment when people realize they can't recreate understanding, so they mimic form. Surface first, assumption second, hope third. It never lasts. Slide 12 caught my eye. Autonomous root logic v2. There it was, my old evaluator, rewritten, stripped of nuance. The recursive depth was gone. The exception handling cut down. No pulse checks, no environmental tuning. Just hard paths. Clean on paper, blind in practice. They'd built a machine with no ears. It would run, fast maybe, at first, but it wouldn't know when to pause, when to listen, when to adapt. It would fail, quietly, predictably, like all copies do. David messaged me again, this time with a different tone. Would you be open to reviewing the new logic? Happy to compensate for your time. I didn't reply. Not because of pride, but because there was nothing left to say. They had made their choice. They didn't want me. They wanted the illusion of me, the structure without the soul. But the truth is, you can't reverse engineer presence. You can't replicate listening. And no amount of syntax will fix that. A few days later, I pushed another update to Pulse. Smaller patch. Better handling of cascading delays. Not because anyone asked. Just because it felt right. I let it sit in my private repo. No press, no noise. Still just mine. I remembered something my dad used to say. A real craftsman doesn't chase applause. He chases alignment. It never made sense when I was young, but now it did. Pulse was aligned. With time, with pattern, with reality. Not just with what looked impressive on a whiteboard. Linda called that night. We didn't talk long. She said the company was holding an all-hands meeting soon. Reset strategy. New leadership on the way. Same promises, same slogans. And probably the same cycle. I asked if she'd leave. She paused. Not yet. I want to see how far they fall trying to fake what they had. Her voice wasn't bitter. Just tired. The next morning, I walked past the old office. Same building, same lights, but it felt different now. Like a place that had forgotten why it existed. I stood outside, didn't go in, didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. Some systems die from failure, others die from forgetting. Eve hadn't failed, they had. By pretending it wasn't built on a relationship. By copying behavior instead of revisiting meaning. You can mimic output, but you can't mimic care. And care was the original language. Back home I reopened Pulse. Scanned the logs. Clean, sharp, breathing. Then I added a small note in the footer of the next build. Built from memory, tuned by time, not for sale. And I meant it. I didn't go to the final board meeting, but I heard how it went. Quiet room, long faces. A presentation that read like a post-mortem in real time. Metrics didn't lie. Churn was up. NPS was down. Internal morale hit an all-time low. They blamed transition, blamed market volatility, even hinted at product fatigue. But they never blamed what really happened. They forgot where the system came from, and what it needed to stay alive. A week later, David stepped down. No press release, just a line in a newsletter. Linda left too. She didn't say goodbye, didn't need to. Some exits speak for themselves. I kept building, kept refining Pulse. It was no longer a fork. Not a counter-project, not even a response. It had become its own thing. Alive, still small, still private, but breathing like I remembered systems should. Sometimes I wondered if they'd try to contact me again, offer equity, ask to merge tech, make a story out of survival, but no message came. And that was fine, because I'd already learned something more important. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect, what you refuse to let go even when the world tells you to move on. I printed the last page of Pulse's documentation, taped it on the wall, same spot where the copyright certificate once hung. It read, "Built for those who listen." Nothing more. No signatures, no credits, just that. I get emails sometimes, from strangers, from engineers who stumbled onto a few fragments I posted. They ask how I thought through decision trees, how I handled edge cases, what I believe systems are supposed to do. I answer when I can, not with code, with questions. Because teaching someone to listen matters more than handing them a solution. There's a rhythm to real things. Not always elegant, not always obvious, but honest. That's what I try to preserve. That's what matters now. If you've followed this story to the end, maybe something in it mirrored your own. Maybe you've been replaced. Maybe your work was passed off. Maybe you were told you were just technical. Maybe you built something that only made sense because of how much of yourself you gave it. If that's you, don't forget your rhythm. Keep it. Guard it. Let it evolve, but never let it be rewritten by people who never showed up for the first commit. And if stories like this matter to you, quiet ones, carefully built, told without noise, consider subscribing. Not because of what I might post next week, but because there's more to say. About systems. About silence, about building things that last, and maybe, just maybe, you'll recognize something of your own story inside mine.